Hi there. In the second part of the tutorial, I'm going to show how to create the water effect here, the sea lapping against the shore, how to do the foam along it, and how to do the wetting of the sand along the water's edge there. So this is where we left the scene in part 1, and what we're now going to do obviously is add the water along here. So to start with, I'm going to turn off these particles to make the UE more responsive as we work on it. So there's just our beach scene without any of the particles, and I'm going to add a simple plane. We'll move that roughly into position and making sure that it's on the same layer as the rest of the land, we'll just rescale it to fit. So as you can see, because the land is sloping in that area, any rising or falling of the water will cause it to rise up and down the land. I'll just set the level to about where I think it needs to be, and you can see the land slopes down there. And that's what gives us the effect. So if we look at material there, you can see the water's just coming up our sandy beach. So if we go to modifiers, and we'll add the ocean modifier. You can see under the simulation section. You can see it's very large to start with. And we want to make sure we generate foam, as that's important to our scene. And what you can see is as we vary the time, you can see the whole thing moves around, oscillates the way real waves do. We need to make sure we set the start and end point for the cache appropriately. So I'm just working on 250 frames, so 1 to 250 is fine. And we need to adjust the spatial size. I used 10 in my version. Let's start with a resolution of 12, but we'll use a higher resolution later. Depth of 1 and a choppiness of 2. And we'll set the scale to 0.25 at the moment. So you can see that's starting to get a bit more gentle now. And we'll go for 0.005 for the smallest waves. So that's obviously have big waves and small waves. And for the foam coverage, we'll go to 0.7. It's important we give the foam a name. So I'm going to call it Seafoam 1. And we'll use that name later to actually access the foam layer. We need to have saved the file so that the cache path will work, and we'll leave the default for foam fade, and of course our start and end frames need to be appropriate. Under geometry you can use generate, which effectively just replaces the existing plane, but what I ended up doing was to keep a bit more control over the number of vertices. I actually used displace. That adds a displacement based on the generated sea effect to the existing plane. Now that plane hasn't got very many vertices at the moment, so that's why it's really not looking like ocean. So we're going to subdivide it, and you notice by sliding the mouse you only get 10, but if you click in there you can type in more. So I'm going to put 50 to start with, and you can see we're getting some variation along the surface now. If I vary the time, you can see it's all going up and down. I'm going to add a subdivision surface to sort of give it a little bit more detail in the surface and set it to smooth shading. You may need to adjust the alignment in order to get the waves lapping up the shore rather than along it. And you may want them to be sort of at 45 degrees so that you get waves that sort of come in at an angle to the shore, depending on what you want. And you can see it's going up and down the shore, but it's a bit too much at the moment. So we'll try a depth of 0.1. The depth really relates to, it simulates the depth of the seabed just underneath the sea. So it alters the way the simulation works a little bit. It doesn't really change the depth of the waves. To do that, we need to adjust the scale. So we'll try 0.025, that might be a bit too small. It is working. And we'll add a basic material to the sea so it's a bit easier to see. So we're now going to animate the time factor, which obviously gives us the animation for the water. Add a keyframe at frame 0, set it to say 3, press I to add another keyframe, and now we can play the animation in real time, or at least at 6 frames per second, and you can see the water starting to lap up and down the beach. If I turn the subsurf off, the simulation runs a little quicker. So that's beginning to get to the point of what we need. So if we look at what the camera would see, you can see we're getting some gentle movement of the water up and down, but bear in mind this isn't always 25 frames a second, it's slightly slower than that, but it might still be possibly a little fast. And we can now put the resolution up, which will make it take a little bit longer of course to simulate, but you can see we're getting more detail now in the way the water moves. And we might want to speed it up slightly. So there we go, I'm varying the time by 5 now across my 250 frames, and you can see the water going up and down the beach. That again might be a little too much possibly, because we're only running at 12 frames a second at the moment. So we go to the last frame and we'll put that down to 3.5, press I, and there we go, that's slowed it down a little bit. That's the basic idea of what I wanted, which is water going up and down the shoreline or the beach. So I'm just varying the average height now. That's good. So we'll take a look at the materials now. So we'll just set a simple mix shader and we'll put a glossy on one side and a transparent on the other. I could use glass and set the index of reflection down, but it tends to add a lot of noise to the scene. If you can avoid it, it's best to not use the glass shader. Sometimes you have to, but if you can avoid it, then don't. Especially if you're going to do an animation where you're not going to have the time to put as many samples into each frame. So we'll just have a look at that in the preview render. Turn the lights on. And you see we've got some very basic water there. So we'll now go to the node editor and start to have a look at those materials. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add an attribute. And this is to allow us to bring the foam into the scene. So we called it Seafoam. So if we copy that and paste that into there, then we'll add color ramp and we'll take the color output. We could just as easily use the factor of the attribute into the color ramp, and we're going to take the output into a mix shader. So we'll make another mix shader. This is going to be fed into the factor of the mix shader. So we're now going to add a diffuse, just a simple white, and that's going to go into one side of the shader, and then into the other is going to go our glossy, and then that outputs to our surface. I'll just move this stuff up here a bit. So what we've got now is that the foam is determining whether we display a simple diffuse white or whether we display the transparent glossy effect. So you can see we've now just got a very white area, and we can start to play with the control up here. So you may find you need to bake it in order to get it to work. And there you go. You can start to see now, as I vary the control under the color ramp, you can see we've got changes between white and transparent in our seafoam. There's obviously work to do on it yet. So that's all foam, and this is sort of eating away at it. And you can you can use this to make the foam much more defined or much less defined. And you may need to play with the resolution as well. Increasing that will make it look better. But the main thing we need to do now is we need to add further texturing to that foam. You can see it even casts shadow further on down. So rather than a simple diffuse white, I'm also now going to add a couple of noise textures, and those are going to affect how this whole thing works. That's the basics of it. So I'm now going to replace all of this with a rather more extensive node tree, and then we're going to work through that. So you can see it's rather a lot more to it now, but essentially it's working on the same sort of principles with a few extra little bits added. So let's work through what this is doing. Here's our attribute again, going into our color ramp, and this is going into a subtract node. So this is going to subtract from the attribute whatever's in the other side. So let's have a look at the other side. Taking it all the way back here, don't worry about this. This is texture coordinates. You may or may not need to use this, but it just tells it whether to use UV or generated. The important thing is these here. I've got two noise textures. I've got a Voronoi noise texture, and I've got just a random noise texture. Take a note of the scale. I've got 155 on one and 60 on the other. You may need to change these. They're going into color ramp, so I can control exactly how much and what parts of the noise are used in the next section. They get subtracted one from the other. So this is now a combination of those two noise effects. And then finally they get subtracted from the foam attribute. That is then used to go into the factor of this mix shader. So if we look at what's on one side of this mix shader, we can see this is one side. So there's another mix shader here, and we've got a diffuse and a glossy. So that's just essentially that's a glossy white texture, mostly white with a little bit of glossy. So that's the equivalent of the diffuse that I had originally, but I've just made it a shiny white, as you'd expect, because the foam is wet. So then we look at the other side of it. There's a glossy again. Now I'll come to this layer weight element in a minute, but on the other side we've got this transparent, there's a Fresnel set to 1.3 and a mix shader. So if we talk about this bit, obviously the transparent, as the name suggests, gives us a transparent effect, but we've also, and it's mostly transparent because the factor is 0.3, therefore it's mostly toward the top, but there is a little bit of Fresnel or Fresnel on this, and what that does is gives you a sort of lensing effect, a bit like looking through real water. And water has an index of reflection, an IOR value, somewhere around 1.3 to 1.4. So 1.3 is a good starting value, and I've just made it such that the majority of the effect of this set of nodes is transparent, but with a little Fresnel in there as well. And the output of that is fed into the top. And as I say, on the bottom, we've got glossy. Now this layer weight, so what that does is it looks at whether it is a Fresnel ray or a facing ray. Now we've selected the facing rays, so depending on the angle of the normal that the ray of light is bouncing off will depend on how much that factor affects it. So if it's a very direct light beam, so it's coming almost from the camera and bouncing straight back into the camera, that will go one way, so that will take it to the transparent and Fresnel side. If on the other hand it's coming from a much more shallow angle and bouncing off, it will make it much more toward the glossy side, so it make it more reflective. So you can see here where the angle on the water varies. We're getting some areas which are more transparent and some areas which are more reflective. So it's a bit like the effect you would get looking at water, and then in order to overcome it you might put your Polaroid glasses on. So other than that, you don't really need any of this. It's just a fine detail that you can add in order to make the water look a little more realistic, but you can still stick with just the diffuse on one side and the mixed transparent and glossy on the other side, and that'll do almost the same. That goes into this mix shader, which is then affected by the combination of the noise down here and the attribute that we already set. Again, you could take the noise off completely and just use the attribute. You can see how that noise was affecting it, and that will then mix between our simple water effect and our simple foam effect. And you can add more layers of noise if you want to. You could add colored foam if you want to, depending on what effect you're trying to achieve. So then finally that feeds out into the surface, and then in addition, to add a little bit of extra realism and effectively add sort of tiny little wavelets, I've got another simple noise texture down here managed by this color ramp. Again, color ramps are good for managing what parts of an input image or effect you want to use. Putting it through a multiply node in order to scale it down. So instead of being 0 to 1, it's now 0 to 0.6. This multiplies it by this number, and then that just goes into displacement. So that gives me a little bit of sort of random ripples all over the surface. These aren't actually animated, but if you wanted to animate them, you could put a mapping node in here and then animate the location of that mapping node, which would make the noise ripple all over the place rather than be static. But because the whole water's moving, it's not really necessary to do that. So one of the things you might do is you might turn up the size of the resolution if you want this to be more realistic. So we could do 32. You need to bake it at least once to get the ocean to simulate the foam, and if you change the resolution it's worth baking it again, but you'll often find that you need to free the bake in order to make changes to the material and things, but it'll still have a cache with the foam layer in it, and you can see it's off simulating now. So I baked it and then I freed the bake. If you leave it baked, it doesn't seem to work very well with the foam. So you need to free the bake because it's really only mainly the foam that we want it for anyway. So that's basically got our sea working. You can also unwrap the sea texture if you want to. It's just a plane obviously, so just look from above and UV unwrap to bounds. So it'd be project from view bounds when you look over the top. And that can then make it a little bit easier to manipulate the scale of the sea and so on. But you really want to keep it the same scale as the original. So we've now got our basics of our foam. You can play around with that for a lot longer to make it look a little nicer. We now need to add the effect of wetting on the sand as the sea laps up and down. So we need to use dynamic paint for that. So if we select the land, we go to physics and we say dynamic paint, and we set that to canvas, add canvas. It's worth using anti-alias so that it makes it look a little smoother at the edges. Make sure that the frames start and end are set to equal the number of frames you're going to be animating over. You can set subframes. This just makes it do more calculations. If you find you're getting sort of patches missing where the sea is lapped up, it may be because the sea's moving very quickly, in which case you can add subframes to help deal with that. The default should already be set to dry. You may also want dissolve as well, and I had my dry and dissolve set to 25 frames and leave the influence and radius scale at default. For the dynamic paint output, you need to click this little plus, and I used the wet map as well. And there are obviously other things you can use like spread and so on if you want it to sort of seep into the sand. But that's fine for the beginnings of our dynamic paint, and it's worth noting these names down here. So now we select our ocean, our sea, and we add dynamic paint to that. But this time it's brush, and we select add brush. So it'll have a default color, and that's fine. And for our purposes, because we're not really using a volume as such, we need to set this to proximity. And we'll set the paint distance to start with to 2. We may want to change that, and project on the z-axis. So what that does is it will project the sea downward, or in an up and down axis, onto the land, and we'll leave the fall off as smooth, and we don't need to change anything else. So if we go back to the beginning, we can now see, you can see there's a little blue rim now to the sea, and as the sea rises and moves up the land, you can see it turns more of it dark. Now we've got the subsurf there. If we put the subsurf on for the sea, you can see there's more detail on the sea now, but obviously it takes longer to do the calculations. And obviously most of the damping effect we want actually underneath the water anyway, but then obviously what it's going to do is it's going to drop back, hopefully. We go back to beginning, I'll turn off this. As it drops back, see it's fading out a bit too quickly at the moment, so what we may want to do is increase the dry time. So let's try 75 for that. So we'll go back to the beginning, and we'll put that on the dissolve time as well, and you can see it stays up there much longer now and then slowly catches up. So I think we're going to go even higher than that. There you can see it now. If I go back to the beginning, as the sea drops down, we get the blue, which is the dynamic paint area, left there for a little bit, but then it starts, as the sea moves further away, it starts to fade out and catch up with the water. You can see it there, for example, and there it's drying out. And you can obviously set that to whatever you feel looks best. So we now go to the texture for our land, and we need to affect that texture based on whether it's wet or not. So here's our basic texture, and if I add a gamma node and just drop that in there, you can see that as I turn this number up, the whole land gets darker. I'm going to leave that one there, and I'm going to put in a color mix node, and we'll drop that there. So I've got the basic land texture on one side, so if I set that to 0, that's the basic land texture, and at 1, that's the darker texture. Now what I'm going to do is I need to use the dynamic paint to affect which of those is displayed. So again, I'll add an attribute, and if we check down here, we're going to use our paint map. We could use the wet map as well, and just type it in. So it's going to be DP paint map, and we're then going to use that, the factor out of that, to control the color of our land. And as you can already see, there is our damp patch on the sand. So if I bring the factor back in, there it is. And really, that's all there is to doing that effect. So that will rise and fall with the water. And if I come back here, you can see it's much closer. And we can then decide how dark we want that to be, or we can change the color of it or whatever, because it's obviously swapping between one and the other. One of the good things about just using something like a gamma node is that all the same variations in color are there, it's just a bit darker. So if you had some stripes or whatever it was, some stone effects in the texture itself, they'd still show through, they'd just be a little bit darker because they're wet. And then if we come a little bit later, you can see how that's working. So really, that's all there is to creating this scene. And here we are with a final render that's starting to build up. We've got our foam running along the edges of the water there. We've got the water nicely lapping up. You can see where the water's just receded from because it's darker on the beach there. You could, of course, change any of these textures. You might want to reduce the amount of grass and affect the colors in it. You need to play with the lighting a little bit. I've used just a straightforward background, and that also applies light to it. But essentially, you can play with it however you want to. I also added a boat to my scene just to add a bit of interest. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, let me know. And if you've got any questions or any requests for other tutorials, let me know in the comments below. Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks a lot.